Hi guys, another Mrs. H Psychology for the gender topic. This is video 7 in my series. It's for psychodynamic explanation of gender. Okay, so it's geared up very much to the new spec and the new materials that we've got, the new textbooks. So there is my older version, which is pretty much the same, but this has just some slightly different references in it. Okay, so if you find this useful, I'd love it if you would subscribe or like it, and also leave any constructive comments to help me improve them as well. I'm hoping that they're helping students and new teachers, so any positive feedback would be great. Okay, so what we need to know, right, there's a real temptation for students to describe, to spend too long describing. These are the key terms you want to get in for your AO1, and actually you want to just get them in and then move straight on to AO3s. So what do we need to say? Freud believes, and remember, you don't need to accept this, you just need to know what he's saying, so you don't have to agree with it. He believes that gender development occurs only at the phallic stage, which is roughly about 3 to 6 years. Okay, remember he has other psychosexual stages, but they are not relevant here. It's just the phallic stage. And what happens is the boy goes through Oedipus, so mention that. Girl is through Electra. Okay, so make sure you're clear, boy, Oedipus, girl, Electra. And what happens is the child lusts after their opposite sex parent. And unfortunately, that will mean that the child, for example, if we're talking about a boy, will become in conflict. He fears that his father is going to castrate him because he's going to take away the thing that gives him pleasure at that stage. So he has fear, real fear, that his father is going to punish him for lusting after his mother. But at the same time, he loves his father, and so he comes into real conflict about these mixed emotions. So to resolve the conflict, he uses this defense mechanism, which is identification. And so he identifies with his father, and that means he will then internalize his father's behaviors. Now, that means all sorts of behaviors, including moral behaviors, but actually here we're just talking about gender behaviors. So he will take on the mannerisms, the attitudes, the values of his father, but here very specifically also the father's gender behaviors. For girls go through the Electra complex, and Freud was not quite so clear on that, but basically the same principle applies. The girl is lusting after her father. She realizes she can't be castrated because she already has been castrated. She doesn't have a penis, so she blames her mother for that. And actually what she will do to the conflict she has is she fears the loss of her mother's love. And so she will go through the same process. She'll identify with her mother and internalize her mother's gender behaviors. So that's the AO1 we need. Now we need to evaluate this. So we need to move swiftly onto that. Right, here's some references I'm going to use. But remember, in the gender section, the evaluation must be evaluating his gender theory, not his general theory. Not his general theory, but his gender theory. So be careful. I've seen too many students make a mistake about that. So we would want to include strengths, and obviously one of them is that the biological approach also supports Freud's idea that gender behavior is driven biologically, but obviously their interpretation is very different. Their interpretation is that it comes from chromosomes, sex hormones, etc. Okay, and we're just going to, I'm just going to read a couple of these other strengths, supposed strengths that you could use as well. Okay, so let's have a look at the Wieselska study as well. That was from Hodder, page 132, if you guys use that, the Hodder book 2. So basically they asked female participants to rate the attractiveness of pictures of different kinds of men and to assess the quality of their relationships with their fathers. The researchers also compared the similarity of the images females found attractive to those of their fathers. And they found that women who had been well treated by and had close relationships with their fathers as children were attracted to men who resembled their fathers physically. This is 2007. This supports Freud's idea of the Electra complex, where girls' desires become centered on their fathers. So often we hear, the common sense view, if you like, there's a belief that girls are attracted to people who are similar to the fathers. So that would kind of support that. Snorton study we'll see below, and also we can refer to the Friedman study, In 1952, so a lot earlier, found that when a story began with a child doing something nice with their opposite sex parent, and then they're joined by the same sex parent, children produced a sadder end to the story than when a story began with a child doing something nice with their same sex parent and then being joined by the opposite sex parent. So the idea here is it supports the idea that both the Oedipus and Electra complexes of children having more attraction to opposite sex parents and more hostility towards the same sex parent. So moving on, just before I do, be careful. Sometimes students use hands as evidence. For a start, it's not scientific, it's not evidence. Freud used it to support, but it's just a subjective interpretation of Hans's phobia. So it's applying his theory to a specific case. It's unreplicable. It's a case study of one child. It's also very biased, and it's really hugely unscientific. So be careful with that. Okay, so let's go down to the weaknesses of his theory. Okay, so the first one, he believes that children learn gender behaviour only at the phallic stage, but we have all sorts of other information. Remember, the phallic stage is roughly about 4 to 6 years. So the problem with this is it seems, that children have gender ideas, gender identity, for example, much earlier than the end of this stage. Right. So, for example, Thompson found by 3 years old, 90% could show gender identity. And Archer and Lloyd found that 3-year-olds who were played with, on my first video, 3-year-olds who played with opposite sexes games were ridiculed and ostracised by their peers. So in other words, children really very early on, much earlier than he's claiming, have an idea about gender. Secondly, Freud believed that the boys had to be afraid of their fathers, okay, because of this whole castration anxiety. You can read through that. We've got research by Malinowski with the Trobriand Islanders that counters that. So what Malinowski found was that boys in the Trobriand Islands exhibited the signs of hostility Freud described, but not against their fathers, but instead against their maternal uncles, because they are the disciplinarians in that culture. Okay, so this opposes Freud's view because it suggests that boys' hostile relationships with their father may be a reaction to the discipline fathers exert, rather than being sexual jealousy over their mothers. Going on, point 3, Freud believed that children need the nuclear family, 2 parents, in order to really learn their gender identity. But Green countered this. Green followed 37 children between the ages of 3 and 20. And they were in particular families. They were with transsexual family and lesbian families. And he found that all the children had a very clear gender identity, with just the possible exception of one child. So that obviously goes against Freud's idea of you needing a mother and a father, a traditional mother and father. There's kind of nuclear setup. Point 4, SLT, social learning theory, is an alternative because SLT, as you know, believes that children learn from observing any role model and then imitating them. So obviously, you can pause the video here and have a little think about this. But the point here is that with SLT, anyone can be the role model. It doesn't have to be the same sex parent, and that really is much more applicable, we would say, to today's society. Point 5, Freud believed, and he devised his theory on one case, Hans, we've already talked about that, and you can have a read through this. Freud believed, the phobia of horses, particularly the white horse, was symbolic of his fear of his father because of castration anxiety. What had happened was little Hans had seen a cart horse fall down and die in front of him. And obviously today we would say there are completely different explanations for that. The behaviourist, for example, Bowlby's theory of attachment, he's got a slightly abusive mother who's threatening to leave him and threatening to cut off his whittler, as she calls it, and behaviourists with classical conditioning. So we have alternative explanations. Point 6, Freud's view is that strict, harsh fathering would develop a stronger masculine gender identity in boys, okay, because he felt that they had to fear their father in order to have this identification and internalization. It had to be a good, strong fear, first of all. But we see alternatives. For example, from this text, Hill et al., boys with more liberal fathers became more secure in their gender identity, which again counters his idea, more liberal parents, as opposed to more harsh, punitive parents. Point 7, Freud believes that gender development occurs with Oedipal and Electra complexes. And supposedly this, as I've already mentioned, the Friedman study up above supports that. But we've got counter research. For example, lots of studies show that incidence in homosexuals raised by only same-sex parent is no higher than those raised by opposite-sex parents. And we've also got other alternatives that I've mentioned above. The final point really being unscientific. And this is the one that really crosses over from his general theory. So concepts like libido, Oedipus are impossible to measure because supposedly they exist in the unconscious. You can't then test them scientifically. And so therefore, most contemporary psychologists don't consider his theory to have huge merit. Even though we can say that, obviously his general theory has helped masses of people with psychoanalysis, for example. Remember, we want to keep it very, very much focused on the gender theory, though. Okay, guys, as I mentioned, if you like that or you want to leave any constructive comments, would be great. Please subscribe. It helps me to see whether these are being helpful for students and teachers around. And obviously like it if you could. That would be absolutely fab. Thanks very much.